Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into why you absolutely, positively wouldn't survive a single day in medieval times. Forget the knights in shining armour and fairy tale castles you've seen in movies. The truth is brutal, disgusting, and downright terrifying. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You wake up tomorrow morning, but instead of your comfortable bed and modern conveniences, you're lying on a pile of straw that's crawling with fleas in a one-room hut that smells like a barn mixed with a public restroom. There's no running water, no electricity, no antibiotics, and definitely no Starbucks on the corner. Welcome to medieval Europe, where surviving a single day required skills you don't have, knowledge you've never learned, and a tolerance for misery that would make modern people weep. The medieval period wasn't some romantic adventure filled with chivalrous knights and elegant ladies. It was a brutal 1,000-year stretch of human history where life was nasty, brutish, and shockingly short. We're talking about an era that spanned roughly from 500 to 1500 CE, when Europe was clawing its way out of the collapse of the Roman Empire and stumbling toward what we now call the Renaissance. But for the average person living through it, there was nothing Renaissance about their daily existence. Here's what Hollywood doesn't tell you about medieval life. 90% of the population were peasants who lived in grinding poverty. They worked back-breaking jobs from dawn to dusk, owned virtually nothing, and died young from diseases that we can cure today with a trip to the pharmacy. The remaining 10%, the nobles and clergy, lived better, but still endured conditions that would horrify modern sensibilities. Even kings lived in drafty stone castles without proper heating, where privacy was non-existent, and bathing was considered dangerous to your health. Let's start with the most basic human need, food. You think you know hunger because you skipped breakfast once, or had to wait an extra hour for dinner. Medieval hunger was a constant, gnawing companion that never truly left. Famines swept through Europe regularly, sometimes lasting for years. When crops failed, which happened frequently due to poor agricultural techniques and unpredictable weather, entire communities would starve. People ate bark, grass, and anything else they could find just to survive. Even in good times, the medieval diet was monotonous and nutritionally deficient. Peasants lived primarily on bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables they could grow. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions or the wealthy. But even the food that was available would make your stomach turn. There was no refrigeration, so preservation meant salting, smoking, or drying everything. Bread was often made with grain that was mouldy or infested with insects. Milk spoiled quickly and was frequently contaminated. Water was so polluted with human and animal waste that even children drank weak beer instead, because the brewing process made it safer than water. Imagine trying to survive on stale bread, watery porridge, and beer that tastes like it was filtered through a dirty sock. The sanitation situation was even worse than the food. Medieval people had no understanding of germs or bacteria. They thought disease was caused by bad air or divine punishment for sin. Cities dumped human waste directly into the streets or rivers. People lived alongside their animals, sharing the same living spaces with pigs, chickens, and cattle. Personal hygiene was virtually non-existent. Most people bathed maybe once or twice a year, if that. They wore the same clothes day after day until the fabric literally fell apart. The smell alone would overwhelm your modern senses. Imagine the combined stench of unwashed bodies, rotting food, animal dung, and human waste, all concentrated in cramped living spaces with no ventilation. People burned rushes and herbs to try to mask the odours, but nothing could truly eliminate the pervasive reek of medieval life. Your modern nose, accustomed to soap, shampoo, deodorant, and air fresheners, would be in constant revolt. Disease ran rampant through medieval communities like wildfire. The Black Death, which struck in the 14th century, killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. But plague was just one of many killers. Smallpox, typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis, and countless other diseases swept through towns and villages regularly. Without antibiotics, antiseptics, or even basic medical knowledge, a simple cut could become infected and kill you. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for both mother and child. Many women died in labour, and infant mortality rates were staggering. Medieval medicine was based on superstition and guesswork rather than science. Doctors believed in the theory of the four humours, thinking that illness was caused by an imbalance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Their treatments often made patients sicker. They would bleed people to balance their humours, administer toxic substances as medicine, and perform surgery without anaesthesia or sterile instruments. If you got sick in medieval times, you were often better off without medical attention. The social structure was rigid and unforgiving. If you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. There was no social mobility, no chance to improve your circumstances through hard work or education. You belonged to a lord who owned the land you worked, and you couldn't leave without permission. You were essentially property, bound to the soil and subject to your lord's whims. Even if you were lucky enough to be born into nobility, your life was constrained by complex obligations and the constant threat of violence from rivals. Violence was endemic in medieval society. Wars between kingdoms, raids by Vikings or other groups, and local conflicts between lords meant that peaceful periods were rare. Bandits roamed the countryside, preying on travellers and isolated communities. Justice was swift and brutal. Public executions were common entertainment, and punishments for even minor crimes were severe. Theft might result in having your hand cut off. Speaking against authority could get you hanged, drawn, and quartered. The legal system was primitive and often corrupt. Trial by ordeal was a common way of determining guilt or innocence. Accused criminals might be forced to carry red-hot iron bars or plunge their hands into boiling water. If the wounds healed cleanly, they were considered innocent. If not, they were guilty and faced punishment. There were no lawyers, no presumption of innocence, and no appeals process. Justice depended on the mood of the local lord or the whims of superstitious judges. Work in medieval times was backbreaking and dangerous. Peasants laboured in fields using primitive tools, harvesting crops by hand with sickles. They worked from sunrise to sunset during planting and harvest seasons, with little rest. Craftsmen in towns faced different but equally challenging conditions. Blacksmiths worked in sweltering heat near dangerous forges. Millers risked being crushed by massive millstones. Miners descended into dark, unstable tunnels where cave-ins and toxic gases were constant threats. Even the weather was more dangerous in medieval times. The period from roughly 1300 to 1850 is known as the Little Ice Age, when temperatures dropped significantly across Europe. Winters were longer and harsher than today. Rivers froze solid. Crops failed due to shortened growing seasons, and people struggled to stay warm in poorly heated buildings. There was no weather forecasting, so communities couldn't prepare for severe storms or temperature changes. A sudden freeze could destroy an entire harvest, leading to famine and death. Education was extremely limited and mostly restricted to the clergy and nobility. The vast majority of people were illiterate and innumerate. They couldn't read, write, or do basic arithmetic. Knowledge was passed down through oral tradition, which meant that useful information was often lost or distorted over time. There were no books for common people, no schools for peasant children, and no opportunity to learn skills beyond what your parents taught you. The political system was unstable and often violent. Kings ruled by divine right, claiming their authority came directly from God. But this didn't prevent constant power struggles, rebellions, and civil wars. Succession disputes regularly tore kingdoms apart. Lords schemed against each other and their rulers. The church wielded enormous political power and often conflicted with secular authorities. Common people were caught in the middle of these power struggles, suffering the consequences of decisions made by distant rulers. Technology was primitive by modern standards. The most advanced machines were simple watermills and windmills. Transportation was slow and dangerous, limited to walking, riding horses, or travelling in crude wagons over rough roads. Communication was equally slow, relying on messengers who might take weeks to carry news between distant locations. There was no printing press until the late medieval period, so books were rare and expensive, copied by hand by scribes. The built environment was harsh and uncomfortable. Most people lived in small, dark, poorly ventilated buildings. Windows were rare and small, covered with oiled cloth or animal skins rather than glass. Heating came from open fires that filled rooms with smoke and created fire hazards. Privacy was non-existent in crowded living conditions, where entire families shared single rooms. Even castles and manor houses were cold, drafty, and uncomfortable by modern standards. But perhaps most challenging of all would be the psychological adjustment to medieval life. You're accustomed to control over your environment, to making choices about your career, your relationships, your daily activities. In medieval times, virtually every aspect of life was determined by circumstances beyond your control. Your social status, your occupation, your marriage partner, even your daily schedule were all dictated by tradition, authority figures, or simple necessity. The pace of life was governed entirely by natural cycles. There were no clocks, no artificial lighting, no way to extend the productive hours of the day. People rose with the sun and went to bed shortly after dark. Seasons determined when you could work, what you could eat, and whether you would survive the winter. There was no escape from the rhythm of agricultural life, no weekend breaks, no vacations, no retirement. This is just the beginning of understanding why modern people wouldn't survive medieval times. The physical hardships were matched by psychological challenges that would break most contemporary individuals. The combination of poor nutrition, constant disease, back-breaking labour, social oppression, and environmental dangers created a perfect storm of misery that defined daily existence for millions of people. But we've barely scratched the surface of medieval horrors. The religious fanaticism, the brutal entertainment, the primitive understanding of the natural world, and countless other aspects of medieval life would shock and overwhelm anyone transported back from our comfortable modern era. As we continue exploring this topic, you'll discover that every single aspect of medieval existence was designed, whether intentionally or not, to make human life as difficult and precarious as possible. Mental health was a concept that simply didn't exist in medieval times. There was no understanding of depression, anxiety, trauma, or psychological disorders. If you showed signs of what we now recognize as mental illness, you were considered possessed by demons, cursed by God, or simply weak-willed. The treatments were horrific. Exorcism, beatings, imprisonment, or being burned as a witch were common responses to psychological distress. There was no therapy, no medication, no support groups, just isolation and often torture. The constant stress of medieval life would crush your modern psyche within hours. Imagine waking every day knowing that a simple accident could kill you, that your children had only a 50% chance of surviving to adulthood, that war or famine could destroy everything you'd worked for in an instant. The anxiety would be overwhelming. You'd have no coping mechanisms, no way to process the trauma of watching friends and family die regularly from preventable causes. Privacy, something we take for granted, was completely non-existent. Peasant families lived in one-room huts where every conversation, every intimate moment, every bodily function happened in full view and earshot of everyone else. Even wealthy nobles lived in communal arrangements where servants, guards, and visitors constantly surrounded them. You couldn't retreat to your bedroom, lock the door and decompress. There was nowhere to go, no personal space, no solitude ever. The religious oppression would suffocate anyone accustomed to freedom of thought and belief. The Catholic Church controlled every aspect of intellectual and spiritual life with an iron fist. Questioning church doctrine wasn't just discouraged, it was heresy punishable by torture and death. Scientific inquiry was viewed with suspicion. Reading the wrong books could get you executed. Even thinking the wrong thoughts was considered sinful and dangerous. But church attendance wasn't optional. Missing Mass could result in public humiliation, fines, or worse punishments. Your entire week revolved around religious observances. Feast days and holy days dictated when you could work, what you could eat, even when you could have sex with your spouse. The church monitored your private life, your business dealings, your relationships. Priests heard confessions and used that information to control behavior and extract money from parishioners. The superstitions that governed daily life would drive a rational modern person insane. People believed that illness was caused by evil spirits, that bad weather was punishment for sin, that eclipses were omens of doom. They wore charms and amulets to ward off curses, consulted astrologers for important decisions, and lived in constant fear of supernatural forces. Critical thinking was not just absent, it was actively discouraged as dangerous to faith and social order. Women faced particularly brutal conditions that would horrify anyone from our era. They were considered property of their fathers and then their husbands, with no legal rights or personal autonomy. Marriage was arranged for political or economic purposes, often when girls were barely teenagers. Domestic violence was not just tolerated, but encouraged as necessary discipline. Women who spoke out or showed independence were branded as witches, shrews, or worse. Pregnancy and childbirth were death sentences for countless women. With no understanding of hygiene, no pain relief, and no medical intervention available for complications, maternal mortality rates were staggering. Even if you survived giving birth, you faced the heartbreak of watching many of your children die from diseases, accidents, or malnutrition. The psychological trauma of losing child after child was simply accepted as God's will. The entertainment that medieval people enjoyed would shock your sensibilities. Public executions were festive occasions where entire communities gathered to watch people being hanged, beheaded, or burned alive. Animal cruelty was considered amusing. Bear baiting, where dogs were set upon chained bears, was popular entertainment. Cockfighting, bull baiting, and other brutal spectacles were regular diversions. There were no movies, no television, no books for common people. Violence and suffering were the primary forms of public entertainment. The legal punishments for crimes were designed to inflict maximum pain and humiliation. Thieves had their hands cut off. Adulterers were paraded naked through town and sometimes executed. Blasphemers had their tongues cut out. Minor offences resulted in time in the stocks or pillory, where you'd be pelted with rotten food and human waste by jeering crowds. The death penalty applied to hundreds of different crimes, from poaching rabbits to speaking against the king. Social mobility was virtually impossible, but social destruction was always just one mistake away. A false accusation, a failed harvest, a slight to the wrong person could instantly destroy your family's position and livelihood. There was no insurance, no social safety net, no way to recover from financial ruin. Once you fell, you stayed down, and your children inherited your misfortune along with your debts and obligations. The work week never ended. There were no weekends, no paid vacations, no sick days, no retirement. You worked until you died, and if you couldn't work, you starved. Child labour was universal. Boys and girls as young as 5 or 6 were expected to contribute to family survival through farm work, craft assistance, or domestic service. education was a luxury that interfered with the immediate need for every family member to contribute to survival. Communication was painfully slow and unreliable. News travelled only as fast as horses could carry messengers, and even then, information was often distorted or completely false by the time it reached its destination. If your family member travelled to another town and disappeared, you might never know what happened to them. There were no phones, no mail service for common people, no way to maintain relationships across distances. The climate was harsher than today's world. The medieval period included several centuries of cooling known as the Little Ice Age. Winters lasted longer, summers were shorter and cooler, and crop failures due to weather were frequent. There was no central heating, no weatherproof clothing, no ability to predict or prepare for severe weather. People froze to death in their own homes during particularly brutal winters. Fire was a constant terror that could destroy entire communities in hours. Buildings were made of wood and thatch, packed closely together with no fire departments or effective firefighting methods. A single spark from a cooking fire could burn down whole neighbourhoods. People lived in constant fear of losing everything they owned to accidental fires, and arson was a common method of warfare and revenge. The complete absence of modern conveniences would overwhelm you within minutes. No light switches, no running water, no flush toilets, no refrigeration, no heating systems, no comfortable furniture, no clean clothes, no personal hygiene products, no pain relievers, no eyeglasses, no dental care. Every single comfort you rely on daily simply didn't exist. Transportation was grueling and dangerous. Walking was the primary means of getting anywhere, and roads were little more than muddy tracks filled with bandits, wild animals, and hazards. A journey that takes an hour by car today could require days of dangerous travel on foot or horseback. Many people never travelled more than a few miles from their birthplace in their entire lives. The noise pollution would assault your ears constantly. Cities echoed with the sounds of animals, metal hammering, people shouting, wheels grinding on stone, and the general cacophony of pre-industrial life. There was no escape from noise, no quiet spaces, no sound dampening materials. The constant sensory assault would leave you exhausted and overstimulated. Even sleep, that basic human necessity, was uncomfortable and interrupted. Beds were hard straw mattresses infested with fleas, lice, and other parasites. Blankets were rough wool that scratched your skin. Rooms were either freezing cold or stifling hot, depending on the season. Privacy didn't exist, so you'd be constantly disturbed by other people's movements, conversations, and bodily functions. Quality rest was nearly impossible to achieve. The sheer unpredictability of medieval life would drive you to madness. There was no insurance, no emergency services, no social programs, no way to plan for the future with any confidence. Natural disasters, wars, plagues, famines, and personal tragedies struck without warning and without remedy. You lived each day knowing that everything could be destroyed overnight, and there was absolutely nothing you could do to prevent it. This psychological pressure, combined with the physical hardships, social oppression, and complete absence of modern comforts, would break even the strongest contemporary person within hours. You'd be begging to return to your centrally heated home, your comfortable bed, your clean bathroom, your refrigerated food, and your modern medical care before the first medieval day was half over. The romanticised version of the past that we see in movies and books bears no resemblance to the brutal reality that our ancestors endured just to survive from one miserable day to the next. The economic system alone would crush your modern expectations of fairness and opportunity. Feudalism wasn't just a political arrangement, it was economic slavery disguised as social order. If you were born a serf, which 90% of people were, you belonged to the land and whoever owned it. You couldn't leave, couldn't choose your profession, couldn't even marry without your lord's permission. You owed labour to your master, taxes on everything you produced, and fees for basic necessities like grinding grain or using the village oven. Your lord could take your crops, your animals, even your children for service whenever he pleased. There was no negotiation, no labour rights, no way to improve your situation through hard work or innovation. The entire system was designed to keep you exactly where you were born, producing wealth for people who contributed nothing but happened to inherit the right bloodline. Even if you somehow managed to save money, which was nearly impossible, your lord could confiscate it at will for any reason or no reason at all. The taxation system was predatory beyond anything you can imagine. You paid taxes to your lord, to the church, to the king, and to various local officials. There were taxes on your animals, your crops, your tools, your house, even your existence. When you died, your family owed death taxes before they could inherit anything. When your daughter married, you paid marriage taxes. When your son came of age, more taxes. The tax collectors were often corrupt thugs who took whatever they wanted and called it legal. Currency was confusing and constantly changing. Different regions used different coins with different values. Money changers charged enormous fees and often cheated illiterate customers. Most transactions were done through barter, but even that was complicated by local lords who demanded their cut of every exchange. There were no banks, no credit, no way to safely store wealth. Any money you managed to accumulate had to be hidden and could be lost to theft, fire, or confiscation at any moment. Trade was restricted and dangerous. Guilds controlled most crafts and professions, and they didn't welcome outsiders or innovation. If you wanted to become a blacksmith, baker, or weaver, you needed permission from the existing guild members who saw you as competition to be eliminated. Even then, you'd spend years as an unpaid apprentice, often abused and exploited by masters who had no incentive to actually teach you their skills. Travelling merchants faced constant dangers from bandits, corrupt officials, and dishonest business partners. There were tolls at every bridge, checkpoint, and town boundary. Local lords imposed arbitrary fees and taxes on goods passing through their territory. A profitable trading venture could be wiped out by a single encounter with the wrong group of armed men who decided they wanted your merchandise more than you did. The concept of intellectual property was non-existent, but so was the incentive to innovate. If you invented something useful, anyone could copy it without compensation. But more importantly, innovation was viewed with suspicion by both authorities and common people. New ideas were seen as challenges to traditional ways that God had ordained. Inventors and innovators were often accused of witchcraft or heresy for daring to improve upon divine creation. Agriculture was primitive and inefficient beyond belief. Farmers used wooden ploughs that barely scratched the surface of hard soil. There was no understanding of crop rotation, fertilization, or selective breeding. Seeds were saved from previous harvests, leading to gradual degradation of crop quality over generations. Weather prediction was based on folklore and superstition, so planting and harvesting decisions were essentially random guesses. Livestock was scrawny and diseased compared to modern animals. Cows gave barely any milk, chickens laid few eggs, and pigs were small and tough. There was no veterinary care, no understanding of animal nutrition, no selective breeding for desirable traits. Animals died regularly from diseases that are easily preventable today. Losing your ox or horse to illness could destroy your family's ability to farm and survive. Food storage was a constant battle against rot, pests, and theft. There was no refrigeration, no canning, no vacuum sealing. Salt was expensive and often contaminated. Smoking and drying techniques were primitive and unreliable. Grain stores attracted rats, mice, and insects that consumed huge portions of harvests. Spoiled food couldn't be thrown away because there wasn't enough to waste. So people ate mouldy, rotten provisions and suffered the inevitable consequences. The seasonal cycle dominated every aspect of existence in ways that would horrify modern people accustomed to year-round abundance. Spring meant back-breaking labour preparing fields with inadequate tools. Summer meant working from dawn to dusk in brutal heat without protection. Fall meant frantically harvesting and preserving whatever crops survived disease, pests, and weather. Winter meant slowly starving while hoping your food stores would last until the next growing season. Clothing was expensive, uncomfortable, and rarely cleaned. Most people owned one or two outfits that they wore constantly until the fabric disintegrated. Wool was itchy and retained odours. Linen was only for the wealthy. Cotton wasn't available in Europe yet. Leather was stiff and uncomfortable. There were no zippers, no elastic, no synthetic fabrics. Getting dressed involved layers of complicated wrappings, ties and fastenings that took forever to put on and take off. Shoes were luxury items that most peasants couldn't afford. People went barefoot or wrapped their feet in rags, leading to constant injuries, infections, and frostbite. Even expensive shoes were poorly made by modern standards, offering little protection or comfort. Foot problems were universal and severe, limiting mobility and making every step painful for most of the population. Personal possessions were minimal and precious. A family might own a cooking pot, a few tools, some rough furniture, and their clothing. That was it. There were no books, no decorative items, no personal mementos, no toys for children, no musical instruments, no games, no artwork. Life was stripped down to bare survival with nothing extra for comfort, beauty, or entertainment. Storage space was extremely limited. Homes had no closets, no cabinets, no organised storage systems. Possessions were piled in corners or hung from walls and rafters. Finding anything required digging through jumbled heaps of items. Organisation was impossible when you owned almost nothing and lived in a single room with your entire extended family and livestock. Privacy for bodily functions was non-existent and would shock your modern sensibilities. People relieved themselves in front of others without shame or embarrassment because there was literally nowhere else to go. Chamber pots were shared by entire families. Latrines were communal facilities where multiple people used adjacent holes simultaneously while conducting normal conversations. Menstruation was handled without any of the products or understanding we take for granted. Women used rags that were rarely washed and reused constantly. There was no privacy, no pain relief, no understanding of hygiene during this vulnerable time. The shame and discomfort surrounding natural bodily functions made half the population suffer in silence every month throughout their reproductive years. Dental care was primitive torture that most people avoided until the pain became unbearable. Tooth extraction was performed without anesthesia using crude tools. There were no fillings, no cleaning, no preventive care. Most adults had rotted, broken, or missing teeth that caused constant pain and made eating difficult. Bad breath was universal and accepted because everyone suffered from severe dental problems. Vision problems had no solutions. There were no eyeglasses until very late in the medieval period, and even then they were expensive and crude. People who couldn't see clearly were simply disabled for life. Reading was impossible for anyone with vision problems, which further limited their already minimal opportunities for education or advancement. Hearing loss from infections, injuries, or age had no treatments or accommodations. Deaf people were often considered mentally deficient and were excluded from most social and economic activities. Communication with hearing-impaired individuals was nearly impossible without sign language or other adaptive techniques that hadn't been developed yet. Physical disabilities were viewed as divine punishment for sin, either by the individual or their family. There were no wheelchairs, no prosthetics, no accessibility accommodations, no social support systems. Disabled people were often abandoned by their families or became beggars dependent on inconsistent charity from a population that could barely feed themselves. Mental capacity differences were not understood or accommodated. People with learning disabilities, autism, or developmental delays were labelled as cursed, possessed, or simply stupid. They were often abused, exploited, or cast out from communities that had no patience for anyone who couldn't contribute to survival in traditional ways. The complete absence of emergency services would leave you helpless in any crisis. There were no fire departments, no police, no ambulances, no emergency rooms, no search and rescue teams. When disaster struck, you were entirely dependent on whatever help your neighbours could provide, assuming they weren't dealing with their own emergencies. Natural disasters were interpreted as divine judgment rather than natural phenomena requiring practical responses. Floods, earthquakes, storms, and droughts were seen as punishments from God that required prayer and penance rather than evacuation, preparation, or recovery efforts. Communities often made situations worse by focusing on spiritual responses instead of practical solutions. The legal system was arbitrary and cruel in ways that would destroy your faith in justice. Trials were often decided by combat, ordeal, or the whims of local authorities who had no legal training. Evidence was rarely considered. Witnesses could be tortured to extract testimony. Punishments were designed to inflict maximum suffering as deterrence rather than rehabilitation or proportionate justice. Imprisonment was rare because communities couldn't afford to feed and house criminals long term. Instead, punishments were swift and brutal. Public humiliation, physical mutilation, and execution were standard responses to most crimes. The goal was to terrorize potential criminals rather than create a fair system of justice that protected both victims and accused individuals. Women accused of crimes faced additional horrors based on medieval misogyny. Adultery, witchcraft, and speaking against male authority were considered serious offences punishable by death. The burden of proof was reversed for women who had to prove their innocence rather than having their guilt established. Torture was routinely used to extract confessions from female defendants who had no legal representation or rights. Children had no protections or rights whatsoever. They could be beaten, sold, abandoned, or killed by parents with no legal consequences. Child labour was universal and unregulated. Sexual abuse was common and unpunished. Children were considered miniature adults who were expected to contribute to family survival regardless of their physical or emotional development. The complete lack of scientific understanding made every aspect of life more dangerous and unpredictable. People believed in supernatural explanations for natural phenomena, leading to responses that often made problems worse. Medical treatments based on superstition killed more patients than they helped. Agricultural practices based on folklore resulted in poor harvests and food shortages. Weather prediction relied on astrology, folk wisdom, and religious interpretation rather than observation and measurement. Farmers planted crops based on lunar phases and saints' days rather than soil conditions and climate patterns. This led to frequent crop failures that could have been prevented with basic meteorological knowledge. Navigation was primitive and dangerous. There were no accurate maps, no compass until late in the period, no understanding of longitude and latitude. Travellers regularly got lost and died from exposure, thirst, or starvation. Sea voyages were especially perilous, with most ships never reaching their intended destinations due to storms, navigation errors, or piracy. The monetary system was chaotic and unreliable. Coins were frequently debased or counterfeited. Exchange rates fluctuated wildly based on the honesty of local authorities. There was no standardized currency banking system or way to verify the value of money. Economic transactions were gambles where both parties risked being cheated. Credit and investment were primitive concepts available only to the wealthiest merchants and nobles. Most people lived entirely in cash economies where immediate payment was required for everything. There was no way to buy homes, start businesses, or make major purchases without having the full amount in hand immediately. Social mobility was not just limited, it was actively suppressed by laws and customs designed to maintain rigid class structures. Sumptuary laws dictated what clothing, food, and possessions people could have based on their birth status. Attempting to live above your assigned station was illegal and punishable by fines, imprisonment, or worse. Education was controlled by religious authorities who determined what knowledge was appropriate for different social classes. Peasants were deliberately kept ignorant to prevent them from questioning their circumstances or developing skills that might allow them to escape their assigned roles. Even basic literacy was seen as potentially dangerous for common people. The pace of technological change was so slow that multiple generations would pass without any significant improvements in living conditions. Your great-great-grandparents lived essentially the same way you would, using the same tools, facing the same problems, with the same limited solutions. There was no expectation that life would improve or that innovation would solve humanity's problems. This technological stagnation meant that accumulated human knowledge was minimal and fragile. Libraries were rare and vulnerable to destruction by fire, war, or neglect. When experts died, their knowledge often died with them because there were no systematic ways to preserve and transmit complex information across generations. The psychological impact of living in such a static, hopeless environment would crush modern spirits accustomed to progress and improvement. Knowing that your children and grandchildren would face exactly the same hardships you endured, with no possibility of advancement or escape, would create a despair that few contemporary people could withstand. Every single aspect of medieval existence was designed, whether intentionally or through ignorance, to make human life as difficult, dangerous, and miserable as possible. The combination of physical hardship, social oppression, economic exploitation, religious fanaticism, technological primitiveness, and complete absence of modern conveniences created a perfect storm of human suffering that continued for centuries. Your modern mind, body, and expectations would collapse under the weight of medieval reality within hours. The romantic fantasy of knights and castles would evaporate the moment you experienced the actual conditions that defined daily existence for our ancestors. You wouldn't just struggle to survive medieval times, you'd be begging to escape them before your first day was half over. But the horrors of medieval life extended far beyond what we've already covered. The very concept of childhood, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. Children weren't seen as innocent beings deserving protection and nurturing. They were viewed as miniature adults who needed to start contributing to survival immediately. By age 5, children were working alongside adults, performing dangerous tasks that would horrify modern parents. They hauled water from contaminated wells, tended fires that could burn them alive, and worked with sharp farming tools that regularly caused severe injuries. Child mortality was so common that parents often didn't name their babies until they survived their first year. Imagine the psychological impact of that reality. You couldn't allow yourself to become emotionally attached to your own children because the odds were strong that half of them would die before reaching adolescence. This emotional detachment was a survival mechanism, but it created a society where childhood trauma was not just common, but expected and accepted. The games children played reflected their brutal reality. They didn't have dolls or toy soldiers. Instead, they played with animal bones, practiced combat with sticks, and learned adult skills through play that often resulted in serious injuries. There were no safety regulations, no child-proofing, no concept that children's environments should be made safe. They learned to navigate a dangerous world by experiencing that danger firsthand, and many didn't survive the learning process. Marriage was another institution that would destroy modern sensibilities. Love had nothing to do with it. Marriage was a business transaction designed to consolidate property, forge political alliances, or simply ensure survival. Girls were often married off as young as 12 to men they'd never met, sometimes decades older. The wedding night was frequently a traumatic assault that we would classify as rape today, but it was considered a husband's legal right and a wife's religious duty. Divorce was virtually impossible and carried severe social and economic consequences. Women who left abusive husbands faced destitution, exile, or even death. They had no legal recourse for domestic violence, which was not only accepted but encouraged as necessary discipline. Husbands could beat their wives with impunity as long as they didn't cause permanent damage, and even then, the woman was often blamed for provoking the violence. The concept of romantic love that we take for granted was literally a foreign concept. Poetry and literature about courtly love existed among the nobility, but it was fantasy entertainment, not a guide for actual relationships. Real marriages were about survival, reproduction, and economic necessity. Emotional compatibility was irrelevant. Sexual satisfaction for women was not just unimportant, it was often viewed as sinful and dangerous. Pregnancy was a death sentence that women faced repeatedly throughout their reproductive years. There was no birth control, no family planning, no understanding of reproductive health. Women became pregnant as often as biologically possible, often bearing 10 or more children in desperate hope that a few would survive to adulthood. Each pregnancy brought the very real possibility of death from complications that are easily treatable today. The birthing process was conducted by ignorant midwives who had no medical training and often made situations worse through superstitious practices. They might try to speed labour by giving the mother toxic herbs, or they'd perform brutal procedures with dirty hands and contaminated instruments. Caesarean sections were only performed when the mother was already dead, in hopes of saving the baby. Surviving childbirth was literally a miracle that many women didn't experience. Even if you survived birth, the postpartum period was fraught with dangers. Infections were common and usually fatal. There was no understanding of hygiene during recovery. New mothers were expected to return to full labour within days of giving birth, regardless of their physical condition. Postpartum depression was seen as spiritual weakness or demonic possession, treated with prayer, fasting, or exorcism rather than support and care. The food situation was even worse than previously described. Starvation wasn't just a risk during famines, it was a constant companion for most people. Even in good years, the majority of the population lived on the edge of malnutrition. Calories were scarce, nutrition was poor, and food safety was non-existent. People ate mouldy grain, rancid meat, and contaminated vegetables because the alternative was death from starvation. Cooking methods were primitive and dangerous. Open fires in enclosed spaces created constant risks of burns, smoke inhalation, and house fires. There were no thermometers, no timers, no way to control cooking temperatures precisely. Food was often burned on the outside and raw on the inside, or cooked so long that any nutritional value was destroyed. Poisoning from undercooked meat or toxic plants was common and frequently fatal. Preservation techniques were unreliable and often made food more dangerous rather than safer. Salt was expensive and frequently contaminated with harmful substances. Smoking and drying were done in conditions that allowed bacteria and parasites to flourish. Pickled foods were often acidic enough to damage teeth and digestive systems. Even preserved foods spoiled regularly, but people ate them anyway because wasting food meant death. The water supply would kill you faster than anything else. Rivers and wells were contaminated with human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial runoff from primitive crafts like tanning and dyeing. There was no understanding of water purification or the connection between contaminated water and disease. People drank from the same sources where they dumped their waste, creating endless cycles of cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. Even the weak beer that people drank instead of water was often contaminated and poorly made. The brewing process was inconsistent, sanitation was non-existent, and quality control was impossible. Beer frequently made people sicker rather than providing safe hydration. But it was still safer than water, which tells you everything about how polluted the water supply had become. Personal hygiene would revolt your modern senses within minutes. People didn't just avoid bathing because of religious beliefs. They avoided it because hot water was difficult to obtain and soap was expensive and harsh. When people did bathe, they often used the same water for multiple family members, spreading diseases and parasites rather than cleaning themselves. Public bathhouses were breeding grounds for every infectious disease imaginable. Clothing was rarely washed and never properly cleaned. People wore the same garments for months until they literally fell apart from accumulated filth and wear. The smell of unwashed human bodies mixed with rotting fabric would overwhelm your senses immediately. Lice, fleas, and other parasites lived permanently in people's clothing and hair, creating constant itching and spreading disease. Hair care was non-existent beyond occasional combing with crude wooden combs that often caused more damage than good. People's hair was matted with dirt, grease, and parasites. Head lice were universal, and there were no effective treatments. Many people simply accepted that their scalps would itch constantly and bleed from scratching. Dental hygiene consisted of occasionally rubbing teeth with a rough cloth or chewing on twigs. There were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no understanding of dental care. By adulthood, most people had severe gum disease, abscessed teeth, and breath so foul it could be smelled from across a room. Tooth loss was inevitable and began early, making eating difficult and speaking unclear. The medical system was not just ineffective, it was actively harmful. Doctors were trained in ancient theories that had no basis in reality. They believed illness was caused by imbalances in bodily humours, so their treatments focused on bloodletting, purging, and other practices that weakened patients further. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or antiseptics, using instruments that were often dirtier than the wounds they were meant to treat. Physicians charged enormous fees for treatments that made patients worse. They prescribed toxic substances like mercury and lead as medicines. They performed procedures like trepanation, drilling holes in skulls to release evil spirits, which usually resulted in death from infection or brain damage. Seeking medical attention was often more dangerous than suffering through illness without treatment. Mental illness was treated as demonic possession or divine punishment for sin. People experiencing depression, anxiety, or other psychological conditions were subjected to exorcism, beating, starvation, or imprisonment in conditions that would drive anyone insane. There was no understanding of psychological trauma, no therapy, no medication, no compassionate care for mental suffering. The economic exploitation was so severe it would trigger revolution in modern times. Peasants were required to give up to half their production to their lords, then pay additional taxes to the church and king. They worked their lord's land for free several days per week, maintained roads and bridges without compensation, and provided military service when demanded. After all these obligations, they barely had enough left to survive. Debt was inherited across generations, trapping families in perpetual servitude. If your grandfather owed money to the lord, you inherited that debt along with the obligation to work it off. There was no bankruptcy, no debt forgiveness, no way to escape financial obligations except death. Entire bloodlines were enslaved by debts they had no role in creating and no hope of repaying. The justice system was corrupt beyond belief. Judges were often illiterate and made decisions based on bribes, personal relationships, or superstition rather than evidence or law. Trials by ordeal forced accused people to undergo torture to prove their innocence. If you survived having your hand burned by red-hot iron, you were innocent. If not, you were guilty and faced additional punishment before dying from your injuries. Punishments were designed to inflict maximum suffering and public humiliation. Minor theft could result in having your hand cut off. Speaking against authority might earn you a public whipping or having your tongue cut out. More serious crimes resulted in hanging, beheading, or being drawn and quartered while still alive. These executions were public entertainment that drew cheering crowds who brought their children to watch. The political system offered no representation or voice for common people. Kings ruled by claiming divine appointment, making their authority unquestionable. Lords controlled local areas with absolute power over their subjects' lives, deaths, and everything in between. There were no elections, no civil rights, no way for ordinary people to influence the decisions that determined their fate. War was constant and devastating for civilian populations. Armies lived off the land, which meant stealing food, burning crops, and destroying everything they couldn't carry away. Soldiers raped women, murdered civilians, and enslaved survivors without consequence. Even when your own side's army passed through, they treated local populations as resources to be exploited rather than people to be protected. The technological limitations would frustrate you beyond endurance. There were no clocks, so time was estimated by the sun's position or church bells. There was no artificial lighting, except dangerous candles or oil lamps that frequently started fires. Transportation was limited to walking or riding animals over roads that were often impassable mud tracks filled with bandits and wild animals. Communication was impossibly slow. Messages travelled only as fast as horses could carry them, and many never reached their destinations due to bandits, weather, or simply getting lost. If a family member travelled to another region and disappeared, you might never know what happened to them. There were no postal services for common people, no way to maintain long-distance relationships or conduct business across significant distances. The complete absence of privacy would drive modern people insane within hours. Peasant families lived in single rooms where every conversation, every intimate moment, every bodily function happened in full view of parents, children, grandparents, and often livestock. There was nowhere to go for solitude, no personal space, no escape from constant human contact and noise. Even wealthy nobles had minimal privacy. Servants, guards, and visitors surrounded them constantly. Important conversations had to be conducted carefully because everyone was listening for information they could use or sell. Personal secrets were impossible to maintain in communities where everyone knew everyone else's business and privacy was viewed as suspicious. The seasonal depression that afflicted medieval people would destroy modern mental health. Winters lasted for months with minimal daylight, no heating except dangerous open fires, and nothing to do except wait for spring while slowly starving. There were no books for entertainment, no games, no activities to pass the long, dark, cold months when outdoor work was impossible. The social isolation was crushing despite the lack of physical privacy. People were surrounded by others but couldn't form meaningful relationships based on shared interests or emotional compatibility. Friendships were determined by proximity and necessity rather than genuine connection. Marriage partners were chosen by others for economic reasons. Even family relationships were strained by the constant struggle for survival and limited resources. The complete lack of social mobility would crush modern ambitions immediately. You were born into a social class and would die in that same class regardless of your intelligence, talents, or efforts. There were no scholarships, no opportunities for advancement, no way to improve your circumstances through education or hard work. Your children would inherit your exact social position and all the limitations that came with it. The technological stagnation meant that life never improved. The same problems that killed your great-grandparents would kill your great-grandchildren. There was no expectation of progress, no belief that human ingenuity could solve problems or make life better. Innovation was viewed with suspicion and often suppressed by authorities, who benefited from maintaining the status quo. This combination of physical hardship, social oppression, economic exploitation, technological primitiveness, and psychological pressure created a perfect storm of human misery that defined existence for hundreds of millions of people across centuries. Every aspect of medieval life was designed to make survival as difficult and uncertain as possible, whether through ignorance, malice, or simple indifference to human suffering. Your modern expectations of comfort, safety, dignity, opportunity, and basic human rights would be shattered within minutes of experiencing authentic medieval conditions. The romantic fantasy of the Middle Ages that we see in entertainment bears absolutely no resemblance to the brutal reality that our ancestors endured simply to survive from one miserable day to the next. You wouldn't just struggle in medieval times. You'd be overwhelmed by despair and begging for escape before your first medieval sunrise reached its peak. The religious control would suffocate you in ways that make modern surveillance states look like playgrounds of freedom. The Catholic Church didn't just influence medieval life, it owned it. Every thought, every action, every breath you took was monitored and judged by religious authorities who had the power to destroy your life on a whim. Questioning church doctrine wasn't just discouraged, it was heresy punishable by torture and public execution. Scientific curiosity was viewed as dangerous pride that challenged God's divine plan. Your daily schedule was dictated entirely by church bells. You woke when they rang for morning prayers, ate when they allowed it, worked according to their calendar of holy days, and went to sleep after evening vespers. Missing Mass wasn't just socially unacceptable. It could result in public humiliation, heavy fines, or being branded as a heretic. The Church collected detailed information about your private life through mandatory confession, then used that knowledge to control your behaviour and extract money from your family. The superstitions that governed every decision would drive rational minds to madness. People believed that illness was caused by evil spirits, that eclipses predicted disaster, that certain numbers were cursed, and that wearing the wrong colour could invite demonic possession. They consulted astrologers before making any important decisions, wore amulets to ward off curses, and lived in constant terror of supernatural forces that existed only in their imaginations but felt completely real to them. Women faced a nightmare of oppression that would horrify anyone from our era. They were considered property, first of their fathers and then of their husbands, with no legal rights whatsoever. A woman couldn't own property, sign contracts, or even leave her house without male permission. Domestic violence wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged as necessary discipline for creatures viewed as inherently sinful and weak-minded. Marriage for women was often a death sentence disguised as a religious sacrament. Girls as young as 12 were married off to men they'd never met, often decades older, in arrangements made purely for economic or political gain. The wedding night was frequently traumatic assault that we would classify as rape, but medieval law considered it a husband's right and a wife's religious duty to submit without complaint. Pregnancy meant facing death repeatedly throughout a woman's reproductive years. There was no birth control, no understanding of reproductive health, and no medical care during childbirth beyond ignorant midwives who often made complications worse. Women bore children as often as biologically possible, watching most of them die in infancy while knowing each pregnancy could be their last. Surviving childbirth was literally miraculous, and many women didn't experience that miracle. The entertainment that medieval people enjoyed would shock your moral sensibilities beyond recovery. Public executions were festive occasions where entire families gathered with picnic lunches to watch people being tortured to death. Hangings, beheadings, burning alive, and being drawn and quartered were popular spectacles that drew cheering crowds who brought their children for educational entertainment. Animal cruelty was considered hilarious fun. Bear baiting, where chained bears were attacked by packs of dogs while spectators bet on the outcome, was regular entertainment. Bull baiting, cockfighting, and watching cats being burned alive in baskets were standard diversions. There were no movies, no television, no books for common people. Violence, suffering, and death were the primary forms of public amusement. The legal system was a nightmare of arbitrary cruelty that would destroy your faith in justice permanently. Trials were decided by combat, torture, or supernatural ordeal rather than evidence or reason. If you were accused of theft, you might be forced to carry red-hot iron bars or plunge your hands into boiling water. If the wounds healed cleanly, you were innocent. If they became infected, you were guilty and faced additional punishment while dying from your injuries. Judges were often illiterate local nobles who made decisions based on bribes, personal grudges, or drunken whims rather than any consistent legal principles. There were no lawyers for common people, no presumption of innocence, no appeals process, and no proportionate punishment. A stolen loaf of bread could cost you your hand. Speaking disrespectfully to authority might earn you a public whipping or having your tongue cut out with dirty knives. The punishments were designed to inflict maximum agony and public humiliation as deterrents. Thieves had their hands amputated without anesthesia using crude saws. Adulterers were paraded naked through town before being stoned or burned. Blasphemers had their tongues removed with red-hot pincers. Minor offences resulted in time in the stocks or pillory, where you'd be pelted with human waste, rotten food, and sharp stones by jeering crowds who considered your suffering entertainment. Child labour was universal, unregulated, and often fatal. Boys and girls as young as 5 were expected to perform dangerous adult work that regularly killed or maimed them. They hauled water from contaminated wells, tended fires that could burn them alive, worked with sharp tools that caused severe injuries, and operated primitive machinery that crushed limbs without safety features or compensation for families. The concept of childhood as a protected period of development simply didn't exist. Children were viewed as miniature adults who needed to start contributing to survival immediately or become burdens that families couldn't afford to support. They received no education beyond whatever skills their parents could teach them between work shifts, no playtime, no toys, and no protection from adult responsibilities, violence, or sexual exploitation. Work never ended for anyone at any age. There were no weekends, no paid vacations, no sick days, no retirement, and no labour protections. You worked from before dawn until after dark every day, except major religious holidays, and even then you often had mandatory church obligations that consumed your time. Children, adults, and elderly people all laboured until they collapsed or died because stopping meant starvation for entire families. The economic system was designed to trap people in permanent poverty while enriching a tiny elite who contributed nothing productive. Feudalism wasn't just a political arrangement, it was legalised theft on a massive scale. Peasants were required to give up to half their production to lords who provided nothing in return, except permission to continue existing on land their ancestors had worked for generations. You couldn't leave your village without permission from your lord, who owned you as completely as he owned his livestock. You couldn't choose your profession, marry without approval, or even grind your grain without paying fees to use the lord's mill. Every aspect of economic life was controlled by people who had never worked a day in their lives but claimed divine right to the fruits of your labour. Taxes were predatory beyond modern comprehension. You paid taxes to your lord, the church, the king, and various local officials who invented new fees whenever they needed money. There were taxes on your animals, crops, tools, house, and existence itself. When you died, your family owed death taxes before they could inherit anything. When children came of age or daughters married, more taxes were due immediately. The currency system was chaotic and designed to cheat illiterate people. Different regions used different coins with constantly changing values. Money changers charged enormous fees and routinely shortchanged customers who couldn't read or calculate. Most transactions were conducted through barter, but even that was complicated by lords who demanded their percentage of every exchange regardless of what was being traded. Travel was incredibly dangerous and usually pointless for common people. Roads were muddy tracks filled with bandits, wild animals, and arbitrary toll collectors who charged whatever they thought they could extract. A journey that takes hours today could require weeks of life-threatening travel on foot through hostile territory where robbery, rape, and murder were constant risks. Most people never travelled more than a few miles from their birthplace in their entire lives because there was nowhere to go and no reason to leave. Every village faced the same problems, offered the same limited opportunities, and provided the same minimal chances for survival. Moving simply meant facing identical hardships in unfamiliar surroundings without the small support network of family and neighbours. Communication was impossibly slow and unreliable. Messages travelled only as fast as horses could carry them, and many never reached their destinations due to bandits, weather, or messengers who were robbed and killed along the way. If family members travelled to other regions and disappeared, you might never learn what happened to them. There were no postal services for common people, and no way to maintain relationships across distances. The complete absence of scientific understanding made every aspect of life more dangerous and unpredictable. People believed in supernatural explanations for natural phenomena, leading to responses that usually made problems worse rather than better. Medical treatments based on superstition killed more patients than diseases did. Agricultural practices based on folklore resulted in poor harvests and food shortages that could have been prevented. Weather prediction relied on astrology, religious interpretation, and folk wisdom rather than observation and measurement. Farmers planted crops based on lunar phases and saints' days rather than soil conditions and climate patterns. This led to frequent crop failures that devastated communities already living on the edge of starvation during the best of times. The technological limitations would frustrate modern people beyond endurance. There were no clocks, so time was estimated by sun position or church bells that rang inconsistently. There was no artificial lighting except dangerous candles and oil lamps that frequently started house fires. Transportation was limited to walking or riding animals over roads that were often impassable during bad weather. The pace of technological change was so slow that multiple generations passed without any improvements in living conditions. Your great-grandparents lived exactly the same way you would, using identical tools, facing identical problems, with identical limited solutions. There was no expectation that life would improve, or that human ingenuity could solve the problems that had plagued humanity for centuries. Innovation was actively discouraged by authorities who benefited from maintaining existing power structures. New ideas were viewed as challenges to divine order and traditional ways that God had supposedly ordained. Inventors were often accused of witchcraft or heresy for daring to improve upon creation. Even beneficial innovations spread slowly because there were no systems for sharing information across regions. The social isolation would crush modern people despite the lack of physical privacy. You were surrounded by others constantly but couldn't form meaningful relationships based on shared interests or emotional compatibility. Friendships were determined by proximity and survival necessity rather than genuine connection. Marriage partners were chosen by others for economic reasons, not love or compatibility. Even family relationships were strained by constant competition for limited resources and the brutal realities of survival. Parents couldn't afford to become too emotionally attached to children who would probably die young. Siblings competed for food and inheritance. Extended families lived together out of necessity rather than affection, creating tension and conflict in overcrowded, uncomfortable living spaces. The complete lack of privacy would drive you insane within hours. Peasant families lived in single rooms where every conversation, intimate moment, and bodily function happened in full view of parents, children, grandparents, and livestock. There was nowhere to go for solitude. No personal space, no escape from constant noise, smells, and human contact that modern people would find overwhelming. The seasonal depression that afflicted medieval people would destroy contemporary mental health permanently. Winters lasted for months with minimal daylight, no heating except smoky open fires, and nothing to do except slowly starve while waiting for spring. There were no books for entertainment, no games, no activities to pass the long, dark, cold months when outdoor work was impossible and survival became a daily struggle. The smell alone would overwhelm your modern senses immediately and permanently. Cities and villages reeked of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, animal dung, and death that permeated everything. There was no escape from odours that would make contemporary people vomit uncontrollably. People burned herbs and incense to mask smells, but nothing could eliminate the pervasive stench of medieval life. Personal hygiene standards would revolt your sensibilities beyond recovery. Most people bathed once or twice per year, if at all, because hot water was difficult to obtain and soap was expensive and harsh. When people did bathe, they often shared the same dirty water with multiple family members, spreading diseases and parasites rather than achieving cleanliness. Clothing was rarely washed and never properly cleaned by modern standards. People wore the same garments for months until they literally disintegrated from accumulated filth and wear. Lice, fleas, and other parasites lived permanently in people's hair and clothing, creating constant itching and spreading diseases throughout communities where everyone was infested with something. The food safety situation would kill you faster than anything else in medieval times. There was no refrigeration, no understanding of bacteria, and no quality control for anything people consumed. Meat was often rotten, grain was frequently mouldy, and water was contaminated with human waste and dead animals. People ate spoiled food because the alternative was immediate starvation. Cooking methods were primitive and created additional health hazards. Open fires in poorly ventilated spaces caused smoke inhalation and frequent house fires. There were no thermometers or timers, so food was often burned on the outside and dangerously raw on the inside. Poisoning from undercooked meat or toxic plants was common and usually fatal without modern medical intervention. Storage techniques were unreliable and often made food more dangerous rather than preserving it safely. Salt was expensive and frequently contaminated with harmful substances. Smoking and drying were done in unsanitary conditions that allowed harmful bacteria to flourish. Even properly preserved food spoiled regularly, but people consumed them anyway because waste meant death. The complete absence of modern conveniences would overwhelm you within minutes of experiencing authentic medieval conditions. No electric lights, no running water, no flush toilets, no heating systems, no comfortable furniture, no clean clothing, no personal hygiene products, no pain medications, no corrective lenses, no dental care, and no emergency services when disasters struck. Every single comfort you rely on daily simply didn't exist in forms that would be recognizable or useful. The gap between modern life and medieval reality is so vast that time travel would be more shocking than visiting an alien planet. At least aliens might have evolved solutions to problems that medieval people couldn't even comprehend, let alone solve. Your modern mind, body, and expectations would collapse under the weight of medieval reality before your first day was half finished. The romantic fantasy of knights and castles that entertainment media has created bears absolutely no resemblance to the brutal conditions that defined daily existence for our ancestors who died young from preventable causes. You wouldn't just struggle to survive medieval times. You'd be overwhelmed by despair and desperately begging for escape within hours of experiencing the authentic hardships that millions of people endured for centuries without any hope of improvement or relief. The harsh truth is that medieval life was designed, whether through ignorance or malice, to make human existence as difficult and miserable as possible, while benefiting a tiny elite who contributed nothing productive to society. The concept of mental health that we take for granted today was completely foreign to medieval minds. There was no understanding of depression, anxiety disorders, trauma, or psychological distress of any kind. If you showed signs of what we now recognize as mental illness, you were branded as possessed by demons, cursed by God for your sins, or simply weak-willed and morally corrupt. The treatments would horrify modern sensibilities beyond description. Instead of therapy or medication, you'd face exorcism, brutal beatings designed to drive out evil spirits, imprisonment in conditions that would break anyone's sanity, or being burned alive as a witch or heretic. There were no support systems, no understanding caregivers, no recognition that mental suffering was legitimate illness, deserving compassion. You suffered alone, in silence, while everyone around you either feared you as dangerous or condemned you as spiritually corrupt. The constant psychological pressure of medieval existence would shatter contemporary minds within days. Imagine waking every morning knowing that a minor accident could kill you, that your children faced coin-flip odds of surviving to adulthood, that war or famine could destroy everything you'd worked for without warning. The anxiety would be crushing and relentless, with no coping mechanisms available except prayer to a God who seemed perpetually angry. You'd witness friends and family members die regularly from causes that are easily preventable today. Watching loved ones suffer and perish from infected wounds, childhood diseases, or simple complications during childbirth would create trauma that accumulated over years with no possibility of healing or professional help. The grief would compound endlessly because death was everyone's constant companion. Privacy, something so fundamental to modern psychological health, was completely non-existent in medieval life. You couldn't retreat to your bedroom and lock the door when overwhelmed because there were no separate bedrooms and no locks. You couldn't take a quiet walk alone because travelling solo meant almost certain robbery or worse. You couldn't even think privately because the church monitored your thoughts through mandatory confession and punished unauthorized ideas. The noise pollution would assault your senses constantly without relief. Cities echoed with sounds of metal hammering on anvils, wooden wheels grinding against cobblestones, animals bellowing and squealing, people shouting to communicate over the din, and the general cacophony of pre-industrial life concentrated in cramped spaces. There was no escape to quiet environments, no sound-dampening materials, no respite from the auditory assault that would leave modern people exhausted and overstimulated. Sleep, that basic biological necessity, was uncomfortable and frequently interrupted in ways that would destroy your health rapidly. Beds were lumpy straw mattresses crawling with fleas, lice, and other parasites that bit you constantly throughout the night. Blankets were rough wool that scratched your skin raw and retained every odour from previous users. Rooms were either frigidly cold or stifling hot depending on weather and fire conditions. You'd be awakened regularly by crying babies, arguing neighbours, animals moving around in shared living spaces, and your own family members getting up to relieve themselves in chamber pots mere feet from your head. Quality sleep was nearly impossible to achieve, leading to chronic exhaustion that made every other hardship more difficult to bear. The entertainment options available to medieval people would shock your moral sensibilities and destroy your faith in human decency. Public executions weren't sombre affairs, they were festive occasions where entire communities gathered with food and drinks to watch people being tortured to death. Families brought their children to observe hangings, beheadings, and people being burned alive as educational experiences about the consequences of sin. Animal cruelty was considered hilarious entertainment that drew enthusiastic crowds. Bear baiting involved chaining bears to posts and releasing packs of dogs to attack them, while spectators placed bets on which animals would die first. Bull baiting, cockfighting, and watching cats being burned alive in wicker baskets were regular diversions that people looked forward to as highlights of their social calendar. There were no alternatives to these brutal spectacles for common people. No books, no theatre performances, no musical concerts, no games beyond simple gambling with dice or stones. Violence, suffering, and death were the primary forms of public amusement, because medieval people had been conditioned to find entertainment in others' misery. The justice system would destroy any faith you had in fairness or rational governance. Trials weren't based on evidence or careful deliberation, but on supernatural ordeals designed to let God reveal guilt or innocence through torture. If you were accused of theft, you might be forced to carry red-hot iron bars in your bare hands. If the burns healed cleanly within 3 days, you were innocent. If they became infected, you were guilty and faced additional punishment while dying from your injuries. Trial by combat was another common method where accused people fought their accusers or hired champions to determine truth through violence. The assumption was that God would ensure the innocent party won, regardless of physical strength or fighting skill. Many innocent people died simply because they couldn't afford better warriors to represent them. Judges were often completely illiterate local nobles who made decisions based on bribes, personal relationships, or drunken whims, rather than any consistent legal principles. There were no trained lawyers for common people, no presumption of innocence, no appeals process, and no proportionate punishment system. A stolen piece of bread could cost you your hand, while murdering a peasant might result in a small fine if the killer had noble connections. The punishments themselves were designed to inflict maximum agony and public humiliation as deterrence rather than rehabilitation or proportionate justice. Thieves had their hands amputated without anesthesia, using crude saws that often caused death from blood loss or infection. Adulterers were stripped naked and paraded through town before being stoned or burned alive. Blasphemers had their tongues cut out with red-hot pincers while conscious crowds cheered. Minor offences resulted in time in stocks or pillories where you'd be immobilised while passers-by pelted you with human waste, rotten food, sharp stones, and anything else they could find. These public humiliation sessions were considered entertainment, and people brought their families to participate in tormenting helpless victims who might have committed no crime beyond speaking disrespectfully to authority. Women faced additional legal nightmares based on medieval misogyny that viewed them as inherently sinful and untrustworthy. Adultery, witchcraft, gossiping, disobeying male relatives, or simply being too intelligent or independent could result in torture and execution. The burden of proof was reversed for female defendants, who had to prove their innocence rather than having prosecutors establish guilt. Torture was routinely used to extract confessions from women accused of crimes, and the methods were specifically designed to be more painful and humiliating than those used on men. Suspected witches were stripped naked and examined for devil's marks, had needles driven into their bodies to find spots that didn't bleed, and were subjected to water torture where they were dunked repeatedly until they confessed or drowned. Children had no legal protections or rights whatsoever in medieval society. They could be beaten, sold, abandoned, or killed by parents, guardians, or employers without legal consequences. Child labour was universal and completely unregulated, with boys and girls as young as 5 performing dangerous adult work that regularly killed or permanently disabled them. Sexual abuse of children was common and unpunished, especially when victims were from lower social classes and perpetrators had wealth or noble status. Children were considered property of their parents and later their employers, with no legal standing to complain about treatment or seek protection from authorities who viewed them as miniature adults responsible for their own suffering. The economic system was designed to trap people in permanent poverty while enriching a tiny elite who contributed nothing productive to society. Feudalism wasn't just political organisation, it was legalised theft on a massive scale where peasants were required to surrender up to half their production to lords who provided nothing in return except permission to continue existing. You belonged to whoever owned the land you worked, and you couldn't leave without permission that was rarely granted. You couldn't choose your occupation, marry without approval, or even grind your grain without paying fees to use facilities you had no choice but to access. Every aspect of economic life was controlled by people who had never performed useful work but claimed divine right to the fruits of your labour. Debt was inherited across generations, creating permanent bondage that trapped entire bloodlines in servitude. If your great-grandfather owed money to a lord, you inherited that obligation along with accumulated interest that made repayment impossible. There was no bankruptcy protection, no debt forgiveness, and no legal recourse against predatory lending practices that deliberately created unpayable obligations. The tax system was predatory beyond modern comprehension, with multiple authorities demanding payment for everything imaginable. You paid taxes to your lord for existing on his land, to the church for spiritual services you were forced to use, to the king for protection he never provided, and to various local officials who invented new fees whenever they needed money for personal luxuries. Currency was deliberately confusing and designed to cheat illiterate people who couldn't calculate fair exchange rates. Different regions used different coins with values that changed constantly based on the honesty of local authorities. Money changers routinely shortchanged customers and charged enormous fees for basic transactions that modern people take for granted. Trade was restricted by guild monopolies that prevented competition and innovation while keeping prices artificially high. If you wanted to become a craftsman, you needed permission from existing guild members who saw you as competition to be eliminated. Even then, you'd spend years as an unpaid apprentice, often abused and exploited by masters who had no incentive to actually teach you marketable skills. Transportation was limited to walking or riding animals over roads that were little more than muddy tracks filled with bandits, wild animals, and arbitrary toll collectors. A journey that takes hours today could require weeks of life-threatening travel through hostile territory where robbery, rape, and murder were constant risks that travellers simply had to accept. Most people never travelled more than a few miles from their birthplace because there was nowhere to go and no opportunities available elsewhere. Every village faced identical problems and offered the same minimal chances for survival. Moving meant facing the same hardships in unfamiliar surroundings without even the small support network of family and neighbours. Communication was impossibly slow and unreliable, limited to messages carried by horseback riders who might be robbed and killed before reaching their destinations. If family members travelled to other regions and disappeared, you might never learn what happened to them. There were no postal services for common people and no way to maintain relationships or conduct business across significant distances. The technological stagnation meant that life never improved for anyone at any level of society. The same problems that killed your ancestors would kill your descendants because there was no expectation of progress or belief that human ingenuity could solve age-old difficulties. Innovation was actively discouraged by authorities who benefited from maintaining existing power structures and controlling populations through ignorance. New ideas were viewed as challenges to divine order and traditional ways that God had supposedly ordained for eternity. Inventors were often accused of witchcraft or heresy for daring to improve upon creation, and beneficial innovations spread slowly because there were no systems for sharing information between communities or regions. The pace of change was so slow that multiple generations would pass without any improvements in living conditions, tools, techniques, or opportunities. Your great-great-grandparents lived exactly the same way you would, facing identical challenges with identical limited solutions that hadn't evolved for centuries. Social isolation would crush modern people despite the complete lack of physical privacy that defined medieval existence. You were surrounded by others constantly, but couldn't form meaningful relationships based on shared interests, values, or emotional compatibility. Friendships were determined by proximity and survival necessity rather than genuine connection or mutual respect. Marriage partners were chosen by parents or lords for economic and political reasons that had nothing to do with love, compatibility, or personal preference. Romantic relationships, as we understand them, simply didn't exist for most people, who were expected to find satisfaction in fulfilling assigned roles rather than pursuing personal happiness or emotional fulfillment. Even family relationships were strained by constant competition for limited resources and the brutal realities of survival that pitted relatives against each other. Parents couldn't afford to become emotionally attached to children who would probably die young, creating psychological distance that protected adults from devastating grief but left children feeling unloved and expendable. The seasonal depression that afflicted medieval populations would destroy contemporary mental health permanently and completely. Winters lasted for months with minimal daylight, no effective heating except dangerous open fires, and nothing to do except slowly starve while waiting for spring weather that might never come if climate patterns shifted unexpectedly. There were no books for entertainment, no organised games, no social activities to pass the long, dark, cold months when outdoor work was impossible and survival became a daily struggle that consumed all available energy and resources. People simply endured endless boredom, punctuated by brief moments of terror when food supplies ran dangerously low. The smell alone would overwhelm your modern senses immediately and permanently, making it impossible to eat, sleep, or think clearly. Medieval communities reeked of human waste, decomposing food, unwashed bodies, animal dung, industrial processes like tanning and dyeing, and omnipresent death that permeated everything without possibility of escape or relief. People burned herbs, incense, and other aromatic substances to mask odours, but nothing could eliminate the pervasive stench that defined daily existence. Your modern nose, accustomed to soap, deodorant, air fresheners, and basic sanitation, would be in constant revolt against smells that medieval people had learned to ignore through necessity. Personal hygiene standards would revolt your sensibilities beyond any possibility of adaptation or acceptance. Most people bathed once or twice per year, if at all, because hot water was difficult to obtain, soap was expensive and harsh, and bathing was considered medically dangerous by authorities who believed it opened pores to disease and evil influences. When people did attempt to clean themselves, they often shared the same dirty water with multiple family members, spreading diseases and parasites rather than achieving actual cleanliness. Public bathhouses, where they existed, were breeding grounds for every infectious disease imaginable, and were eventually closed by church authorities who viewed them as centres of moral corruption. Clothing was rarely washed and never properly cleaned by any standard that would be acceptable today. People wore the same garments for months until they literally fell apart from accumulated filth, sweat, and general wear. Lice, fleas, bedbugs, and other parasites lived permanently in people's hair and clothing, creating constant itching and serving as vectors for diseases that spread rapidly through communities where everyone was infested with something. Hair care consisted of occasional combing with crude wooden implements that often caused more damage than good, pulling out chunks of hair along with some of the larger parasites. Most people's hair was permanently matted with dirt, grease, and various insects that had taken up residence in the tangled mess that covered their heads. The food safety situation would kill you faster than any other single aspect of medieval life, making modern food poisoning look like a minor inconvenience by comparison. There was no refrigeration, no understanding of bacterial contamination, no quality control systems, and no regulatory oversight of anything people consumed on a daily basis. Meat was often partially decomposed by the time it was consumed, having been stored in conditions that encouraged bacterial growth and attracted flies, rats, and other disease vectors. Grain was frequently mouldy or infested with insects, but people ate it anyway because the alternative was immediate starvation for entire families who had no other options available. Water supplies were contaminated with human waste, dead animals, and industrial runoff from primitive manufacturing processes that dumped toxic materials directly into rivers and wells that communities depended on for drinking water. Even wells that seemed clean were often contaminated by seepage from nearby latrines and animal pens. Cooking methods created additional health hazards rather than making food safer to consume. Open fires in poorly ventilated spaces caused chronic smoke inhalation and frequent house fires that destroyed entire neighbourhoods. There were no thermometers, timers, or reliable methods for controlling cooking temperatures, so food was often charred on the outside while remaining dangerously raw inside. The preservation techniques that people relied on were unreliable and often made food more dangerous rather than extending its safe consumption period. Salt was expensive and frequently contaminated with harmful minerals or industrial byproducts. Smoking and drying processes were conducted in unsanitary conditions that allowed harmful bacteria and molds to flourish on supposedly preserved foods. Even properly preserved foods spoiled regularly due to inadequate storage facilities, temperature fluctuations, and pest infestations that consumed significant portions of winter food supplies. People ate spoiled provisions anyway, because wasting food meant certain death for families who were already living on the edge of starvation during good times. The complete absence of modern conveniences would overwhelm you within minutes of experiencing authentic medieval conditions, making it impossible to perform even basic daily functions that contemporary people take for granted. No electric lighting meant that productive activity ceased at sunset, except for dangerous work by flickering candles or oil lamps that frequently started fatal fires. There was no running water, which meant hauling heavy containers from contaminated sources that might be miles away from living areas. No flush toilets meant sharing disgusting communal facilities or relieving yourself in chamber pots that were emptied into streets or waterways that supplied drinking water to downstream communities. No heating systems meant freezing during winter months in poorly insulated buildings where indoor temperatures were only slightly warmer than outdoor conditions. No comfortable furniture meant sitting and sleeping on hard surfaces that caused chronic pain and pressure sores. No clean clothing meant wearing the same filthy garments until they disintegrated completely. No personal hygiene products meant accepting permanent infestations of parasites and skin conditions that caused constant discomfort. No pain medications meant enduring everything from headaches to broken bones without relief. No corrective lenses meant that vision problems condemned people to functional blindness for their entire lives. No dental care meant accepting tooth decay, gum disease, and eventual tooth loss as inevitable parts of aging that began in childhood and progressed rapidly without intervention. No emergency services meant that accidents, fires, medical emergencies, and violent crimes had to be handled by whatever resources communities could provide without professional training or adequate equipment. Every single comfort, convenience, and safety feature that defines modern existence simply didn't exist in any form that would be recognizable or useful to contemporary people. The technological gap between today and medieval times is so vast that time travel would be more disorienting than visiting an alien civilization that had at least evolved solutions to basic survival problems. Your modern immune system, pampered by vaccines, antibiotics, and sterile environments, would collapse instantly when exposed to medieval pathogens. You've been living in a sanitized bubble that's made you evolutionarily soft. Medieval people developed some resistance to diseases through constant exposure and brutal natural selection, but you'd be like a newborn baby thrown into a biological warfare zone. The moment you touched contaminated water or breathed air thick with infectious particles, your body would begin a losing battle against microbes that medieval people carried as permanent residents. Tuberculosis, which killed millions of medieval Europeans, would ravage your lungs within weeks. Dysentery would dehydrate you to death through unstoppable diarrhea that medieval people just accepted as a normal part of life. Your soft, modern hands would be shredded within hours of attempting medieval labour. Blisters would form immediately, then burst and become infected in the filthy conditions where healing was impossible. Medieval peasants developed calluses like leather armour through years of brutal work, but your pampered skin would split open like overripe fruit the moment you gripped a medieval farming tool. The physical strength required for daily survival would exhaust you before noon on your first day. Medieval people weren't gym fit, they were work hardened through decades of back-breaking labour that started in childhood. You'd collapse from exhaustion trying to perform tasks that medieval children accomplished routinely while fighting malnutrition and disease. Your modern diet has made you dependent on processed foods, refined sugars, and consistent nutrition that simply didn't exist. The sudden shift to medieval starvation rations would send your body into shock. Your metabolism, accustomed to regular meals and balanced nutrients, would begin cannibalizing your muscle tissue within days of experiencing authentic medieval hunger. Sleep deprivation alone would destroy your cognitive function and immune system rapidly. Medieval people adapted to sleeping in uncomfortable, noisy, pest-infested conditions through necessity, but your brain requires the deep, restorative sleep that's impossible to achieve on vermin-infested straw mattresses in freezing, smoke-filled rooms shared with snoring family members and flatulent livestock. Your modern teeth, while imperfect, are maintained through daily brushing, fluoride treatments, and professional dental care. Medieval people lost most of their teeth by adulthood and lived with constant oral pain that would incapacitate contemporary individuals. The infected abscesses that medieval people endured routinely would cause agony beyond your tolerance levels. The psychological trauma of witnessing medieval brutality would shatter your mental health permanently. You've been conditioned by modern society to expect safety, fairness, and protection from violence. Watching public executions, seeing children die from preventable diseases, and experiencing the casual cruelty that defined medieval social interactions would create post-traumatic stress that no medieval person understood or treated. Your modern moral framework would be in constant conflict with behaviours that medieval people considered normal and necessary. The treatment of women, children, animals, and social outcasts would violate every ethical principle you've been taught, creating cognitive dissonance that would eat away at your sanity day after day. The information overload would overwhelm your modern brain, which is accustomed to processing vast amounts of data through digital interfaces and written communication. Medieval people learned through oral tradition, direct observation, and repetitive practice, but your learning style depends on technologies and educational methods that didn't exist for another 1,000 years. Your attention span, shortened by constant digital stimulation, would make it impossible to focus on the sustained, repetitive tasks that defined medieval work. Farming required hours of monotonous labour with primitive tools, but your brain craves the constant novelty and instant gratification that medieval life never provided. The social skills required for medieval survival were completely different from modern interpersonal abilities. You'd need to navigate complex hierarchies, religious obligations, and community relationships based on traditions you'd never learned. Your modern concepts of individual rights, personal autonomy, and social equality would mark you as dangerous and subversive. Your speech patterns, vocabulary, and cultural references would immediately identify you as foreign and suspicious. Medieval communities were deeply xenophobic and viewed outsiders as threats to be eliminated or exploited. Your inability to speak in period-appropriate dialects or demonstrate knowledge of local customs would make you a permanent target for violence and discrimination. The superstitious thinking that governed medieval decision-making would conflict with your rational, scientific worldview in ways that would isolate you from every social group. Your attempts to explain natural phenomena through logic and evidence would be interpreted as heretical knowledge that came from demonic sources. Medieval people made decisions based on astrology, religious doctrine, and folk wisdom that you'd find laughably ignorant. But your superior knowledge would be useless and dangerous in a world where challenging established beliefs could result in torture and execution. You'd be forced to pretend ignorance while watching preventable tragedies unfold around you. The economic concepts you understand would be meaningless in a barter economy where abstract financial instruments didn't exist. Your modern job skills would be completely irrelevant in an agricultural society that had no use for digital literacy, analytical thinking, or service industry experience. Even basic mathematical concepts that you take for granted were unknown to most medieval people who couldn't read, write, or calculate beyond simple counting. Your ability to perform complex mental arithmetic would be viewed as supernatural and potentially demonic. rather than useful or impressive. The legal protections and civil rights you've always assumed would be stripped away instantly. You'd have no recourse against theft, assault, fraud, or abuse because medieval justice was arbitrary and corrupt. Your modern expectation of fair treatment and due process would be crushed by a system designed to benefit the powerful while oppressing everyone else. Your physical appearance would mark you as different and potentially dangerous. Modern dental work, surgical scars, vaccination marks, and general health would make you appear suspiciously well-maintained compared to medieval people who bore the visible marks of hard living from birth. The clothing, posture, and mannerisms that mark you as a modern person would be impossible to disguise convincingly. Medieval people moved differently, spoke differently, and carried themselves in ways that reflected their harsh living conditions and rigid social hierarchies. Your instinctive reactions to medieval situations would betray your foreign origins constantly. Flinching at casual violence, showing surprise at normal medieval practices, or expressing modern moral judgments would identify you as someone who didn't belong in that world. The cumulative stress of pretending to fit into medieval society while suppressing every natural reaction would create psychological pressure that would eventually cause you to break down publicly. And in medieval times, public mental breakdowns were interpreted as demonic possession requiring immediate and violent intervention. Your modern body language, facial expressions, and social cues would be misinterpreted constantly, creating conflicts and misunderstandings that could escalate into life-threatening situations. Medieval people communicated through subtle signals and cultural codes that you'd never learned to read or transmit. The seasonal affective disorder that plagues many modern people would be amplified beyond endurance by medieval winter conditions. Months of darkness, cold, and isolation would trigger depression so severe that medieval people would interpret it as spiritual corruption requiring harsh treatment. Your modern circadian rhythms, regulated by artificial lighting and climate control, would be completely disrupted by natural light cycles and temperature fluctuations. The resulting sleep disorders, mood swings, and cognitive impairment would make you appear mentally unstable to medieval observers. The dietary deficiencies that would develop within weeks would cause physical and mental symptoms that medieval people would attribute to moral failings or supernatural influences. Scurvy, rickets, and malnutrition-related cognitive decline would mark you as someone touched by divine punishment. Your immune system's overreaction to medieval allergens and irritants would cause chronic respiratory problems, skin conditions, and digestive issues that would be interpreted as signs of spiritual corruption. Medieval people would view your constant sneezing, coughing, and skin problems as evidence that you were cursed or diseased. The hormonal changes caused by chronic stress, malnutrition, and exposure to medieval toxins would alter your personality and behavior in ways that would make you unrecognizable to yourself. The person you are today would literally cease to exist under medieval conditions, replaced by a traumatized, desperate stranger fighting for survival. Your modern pain tolerance, developed in a world with readily available medical treatment, would crumble under medieval conditions where minor injuries became major disabilities. A simple cut that would be bandaged and forgotten today could become a life-threatening infection that would incapacitate you for weeks. The chronic pain that defined medieval existence would wear down your mental resilience until you became as brutal and desperate as the people around you. Your modern compassion and empathy would be luxuries you couldn't afford when every day became a struggle to avoid starvation, disease, and violence. The gradual erosion of your modern identity would be the most devastating aspect of medieval life. You'd watch yourself become someone you wouldn't recognize, shaped by conditions so harsh that survival would require abandoning every principle and value that defines who you are today. But here's the cruelest irony of all. Even if you somehow managed to survive the first few months and began adapting to medieval conditions, you'd still die young from causes that are easily preventable in the modern world. Your superior knowledge and modern perspective would be worthless against the biological and environmental hazards that killed medieval people regardless of their wisdom or strength. You'd spend your final years as a broken, diseased, prematurely aged version of yourself, indistinguishable from the medieval peasants you once pitied. Your death would be unmarked and unmourned, just another casualty in humanity's long struggle against ignorance, disease, and brutality. The stark truth is that we are not the hardy survivors we imagine ourselves to be. We are soft, pampered creatures who have been shielded from the brutal realities that defined human existence for most of our species' history. And that's not a weakness to be ashamed of, it's a victory to be celebrated. We've built a world where humans can be soft, where survival is assumed rather than fought for daily, where comfort and safety are rights rather than impossible dreams. Medieval times would kill you not because you're weak, but because you're human. And being human in the medieval world was the most dangerous thing you could possibly be. The climate itself was your enemy in ways that would break your spirit before it broke your body. We talk about climate change today, but medieval people lived through what historians call the Little Ice Age. Centuries of cooling that made winters longer, summers shorter, and growing seasons unpredictable at best. Rivers froze solid for months, crops failed regularly, and entire communities simply disappeared when the cold refused to lift year after year. But it wasn't just the cold that would destroy you. Medieval weather was violent and unpredictable in ways that modern forecasting has made us forget. Storms appeared without warning, flooding rivers that wiped out bridges, homes, and people with equal indifference. Hailstorms could destroy an entire harvest in minutes, condemning communities to slow starvation over the following winter. Droughts lasted for years, turning fertile farmland into cracked wasteland where nothing would grow. There were no weather satellites, no meteorologists, no early warning systems of any kind. People relied on folklore and superstition to predict weather patterns, watching for signs in animal behaviour or cloud formations that were about as reliable as rolling dice. When storms struck, communities were completely helpless. Houses built from wood and thatch offered no protection against winds that could flatten entire villages in hours. The psychological impact of living at the mercy of weather you couldn't predict or prepare for would crush modern minds accustomed to 5-day forecasts and storm warnings. Every morning brought uncertainty about whether the day would bring sunshine or disaster. Farmers planted crops knowing that a single unexpected freeze could destroy months of work and condemn their families to death. Winter was particularly brutal because there was no escape from it once it arrived. No heated buildings to retreat to, no warm clothing adequate for months of freezing temperatures, no way to preserve enough food to last through seasons that stretched far longer than modern winters. People huddled around smoky fires that filled their lungs with toxic fumes while barely warming their bodies, slowly burning through wood supplies that had to last until spring. The darkness of medieval winters would drive you insane with depression that had no name or treatment. Imagine months of grey skies, early sunsets, and dawn coming so late that you worked most days without ever seeing direct sunlight. There were no electric lights to extend productive hours, no vitamin D supplements to combat seasonal depression, no understanding that lack of sunlight could cause serious mental health problems. People simply endured the darkness and cold until many of them didn't. Suicide rates spiked during winter months, though medieval authorities attributed these deaths to demonic possession rather than recognizing them as responses to unbearable living conditions. Entire families would be found dead in their homes come spring, victims of cold, starvation, or despair that finally overcame their will to survive. The seasonal cycle controlled every aspect of existence with iron discipline that modern people can't comprehend. Spring meant frantic preparation of fields using primitive tools that broke regularly and couldn't be easily replaced. Summer meant working 18-hour days in brutal heat without protection, trying to grow enough food to last through the next winter while fighting plant diseases and pest infestations with no effective treatments. Autumn brought the desperate race to harvest and preserve whatever crops had survived disease, weather, and pests. This wasn't leisurely farming with modern machinery and storage facilities. This was backbreaking labour using crude tools, racing against early frosts that could destroy unharvested crops overnight. Preservation meant smoking, salting, or drying food using techniques that often failed, leaving families to slowly starve when their winter supplies spoiled. The agricultural knowledge that medieval people possessed was primitive and often counterproductive. They practiced slash-and-burn farming that depleted soil nutrients, had no understanding of crop rotation or fertilization, and made planting decisions based on lunar phases and religious calendar rather than soil conditions or weather patterns. Fields produced pathetically small yields compared to modern agriculture, barely enough to sustain life in good years and completely inadequate during bad seasons. Livestock was scrawny and diseased by modern standards, providing minimal milk, eggs, or meat even when animals survived the various plagues that swept regularly through medieval farms. There was no veterinary care, no understanding of animal nutrition, no selective breeding for productive traits. Animals died regularly from diseases that are easily prevented today, taking with them the primary sources of protein and dairy that families depended on for survival. The tools available for farming and food preparation were crude and inefficient beyond modern comprehension. Ploughs were wooden implements that barely scratched the surface of hard-packed soil. Sickles for harvesting grain were dull iron blades that required enormous effort to cut through crops. Mills for grinding grain were powered by unreliable water wheels or wind that might not blow when you needed flour. The medieval world wasn't just different from ours, it was actively hostile to everything that makes modern life bearable. Every system, every custom, every aspect of daily existence was designed through ignorance and necessity to crush human potential and reduce life to bare survival. Your romanticized vision of medieval times would be shattered within hours of experiencing the authentic conditions that our ancestors endured not by choice, but because they had no alternatives. The harsh reality is that you wouldn't just struggle in medieval times, you'd be destroyed by them in ways that would make you grateful for every modern convenience you've ever taken for granted. The time machine that brought you to the medieval world would become the most precious object imaginable, not because of its scientific wonder, but because it represented your only escape from a nightmare that masqueraded as human civilization. You'd spend every remaining moment of consciousness dreaming of returning to your centrally heated home, your comfortable bed, your clean bathroom, and your safe, predictable modern world. But perhaps that's exactly why this thought experiment matters. Understanding how brutal medieval life really was makes us appreciate not just our modern conveniences, but the centuries of human progress that made our comfortable existence possible. We stand on the shoulders of countless generations who suffered through the darkness so that we could eventually reach the light. The next time you flip a light switch, turn on a faucet, or swallow an antibiotic, remember the medieval ancestors who died in darkness, thirst, and infected agony. Their sacrifice, whether voluntary or not, purchased the world we now inhabit, and that world, for all its problems, is a paradise compared to the medieval nightmare that would destroy any of us within days. So there you have it. The brutal, unvarnished truth about why you wouldn't last a single day in medieval times. Every romantic notion you've ever had about knights and castles has hopefully been shattered by the reality of what life was actually like for our ancestors. From the moment you woke up on that flea-infested straw mattress to the second you tried to fall asleep while listening to your neighbour's pig snoring, medieval life was an unrelenting nightmare that would break you in ways you never imagined possible. The next time you flip on a light switch or grab a snack from your refrigerator, take a moment to appreciate just how incredibly lucky you are to be alive right now, in this modern world that our ancestors could never have dreamed of.